I didn't know there was a name for it. I didn't know that it was misogyny. I didn't know that it was the patriarchy. I didn't know that like all of these things. And so I was like, oh my God, this thing that I have rage about is actually about feminism? Like, wait, what?
This is the Unquiet Sisterhood podcast, where we have uncensored, unapologetic, and sometimes uncomfortable conversations about shit that matters in the lives of women. I'm your host, Jen Pavich.
Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of the Unquiet Sisterhood podcast. So I'm finding myself both excited and nervous about bringing you all this episode a little bit. If you've been listening or reading my work for a while, then you undoubtedly know by now that I'm a pretty outspoken feminist. But what you might not know is that I wasn't always a feminist. And this is something that I've actually been wanting to talk about for a long time, but I've hesitated both because I realized that I still have kind of some residual shame around this particular period of my life, and also because I wanted to really be able to clarify to myself before I talked about it why it was important. So I feel like I've kind of done that now. I've, sort of taken the swirling cloud of half-formed ideas in my head and kind of made sense of them a little bit to realize that why I feel like this is important is because I have had dozens, if not hundreds, of conversations with women over the last 10 years where I've seen that beginning of the realization that a lot of the beliefs that they've held, maybe their entire lives, about things like gender roles and equality and just sort of life as a woman or someone who's feminine identifying have been skewed and influenced by the culture that we live in. It's kind of a light bulb moment for people, and sometimes the light is kind of like on a dimmer switch and it comes on slowly, and other times it just kind of flashes like a flash of lightning. So, and this is totally understandable because this is the soup that we're all swimming in. It's, the soup of being in a patriarchal and misogynistic culture. At the same time, I talk to women all the time who kind of express reservations about whether or not they identify as a feminist, either because it sort of feels unsafe to call yourself a feminist and it's kind of like almost like putting a target on your back, or because they feel like they're somehow unqualified to identify as a feminist, like they don't have enough feminist street cred or, women's studies knowledge or like what have you. And I guess the reason I wanted to bring this up and have this conversation today is because I want to say, no matter who you are or how you've thought about these issues up to this point, come on over. We need all the help we can get in the fight for gender equality, and it's never too late to join that fight. Regardless of who, what you've thought in the past or who you maybe voted for or what belief systems you had before, if you find that your mind is changing about things, there's room for everybody. So I just wanted to kind of start with that. And in my conversation with Andrea Owen this week, we delve into our stories of how we came to identify ourselves as feminists. And before we dive in, I just want to share a little bit about Andrea for those of you who might not have encountered her work yet. So Andrea is a certified life coach, an author, and a hellraiser. Her best-selling book, How to Stop Feeling Like Shit, has been translated into more than 18 languages. She's the host of the podcast, Your Kick-Ass Life, and she helps high-achieving women in her coaching practice to let go of perfectionism, control, and isolation, and choose courage and confidence instead. She's helped literally thousands of women manage their inner critic to create loving connections and live their most kick-ass life. All right, let's get started. Well, Andrea, thanks so much for being on the Unquiet Sisterhood podcast. I'm so excited to have you here.
I'm so excited to be here. I cannot get over how much I love the name of your podcast, by the way.
Oh, thank you. It started out as the name of my Facebook group, and I because I was just trying to get at that, like, I wanted to create a place to have conversations about the things that like niggle at us in the middle of the night, or like sort of, the things that just you can't figure out, or they don't sort of sit right, or they make you uncomfortable, but you're really curious about them at the same time. So yeah, I like this to be a space for all of those conversations. And I think that what we're talking about today fits right into that, right?
Absolutely. For sure.
So what you and I have in common is that we both, I don't want to speak for you, but I think that we both identify as feminists now.
Yes.
But we didn't always. And there's some
No.
and I think there are a lot of women that don't identify as feminists. You know, I mentioned that I wrote a piece on Medium not that long ago called I'm Not a Feminist, But, and it was sort of about these conversations that I had with women where they were like, well, you know, I'm not a feminist, but I do, you know, think that women should be paid equally to men, or I'm not a feminist, but, you know, basically insert text that means I think women should be treated like people, you know.
Right. I
And
had a client once who voted, you know, she was definitely conservative, and she said that she was upset with a man that she knew, it was a family member, because she didn't like the way that he treated his wife, the derogatory comments that he made. And I was like, you might be a feminist if it's the same.
it's
Yeah.
actually funny. I've been working on something called You Might Be a Feminist If, because I think that we need to get more clarity around this term that has been given a lot of baggage, but I feel like at least some of the baggage that's been put on it has been put on it by, you know, kind of the conservative movement and
Totally.
the, you know, by sort of oppressors, if we want to, you know, go that way.
Well, for sure. And I'm curious, like because I can tell you my story of like why I did not identify as a feminist. I'm curious to know why you didn't. Like, what was your definition of one that made you not want to identify as one?
Yeah. So, well, and my story is kind of like a back and forth. So, well, but why don't we start with yours? Because
Okay.
I'm curious to kind of hear the whole thing and why didn't you like, and then how did you start to change that?
I don't even think that I knew what a feminist was. I'm not even sure if I even heard the word. So I grew up in the late 70s and 80s. I was born in 1975. And so it was certainly after the feminist movement of the 60s. And I didn't, you know, Gloria Steinem was not a name that was thrown around in my house. Like, I don't remember my parents ever talking about really anything involving politics or any kind of cultural movements of the sort. And so I didn't hear about it until the boyfriend I had when I was a senior in high school. His family, he had a large family. He was the middle child of 5 boys, and a large, boisterous family. And they were conservative. And they became my in-laws because I married him. He was my first husband. They had Fox News on all the time, and Nancy Grace was on all the time. And I was very familiar with all of those TV personalities. And the term was defined to me as something negative. So I learned that a feminist was a man-hating, many times lesbian, who was kind of a hippie. It was like this. I mean, I think that we all know that picture that gets painted as the negative type of feminist who really just hates men and would rather live in a world without men at all. And that's certainly not who I was. I don't remember hearing really anything about the positives of feminism, you know, about equal pay and just equality. Like, I don't remember hearing any of that. So of course I didn't identify as a feminist.
And then when did you start to sort of become aware of a different perspective of feminism?
There were a couple of things that had happened, mostly school. I'm trying to remember the timeline. So he and I were married, and I had gone back to college. So this was probably in my mid-20s. I had dropped out of college in the beginning. Well, mostly got kicked out because I had a 1.7 GPA and didn't know what I wanted to do anyway. So I took a break for a few years, went back, and then took a religious studies class. And it was really interesting because we were learning about many different things, the Quran, the Bible, like different religions. And I didn't realize that those classes were very sort of, they didn't have an opinion. So it was really just like presenting all of the different ways that people think in different cultures. And I was like, oh, well, that's interesting. So it sort of started there and just starting to question. And this was also like right after, I believe, like 9/11. So there was all this hype about how bad the Middle East was and how awful they were and how afraid we should be of them. And I was learning another perspective. And so that actually just sort of planted the seed of, hey, everything I'm learning here through the news and through my family might not actually be true. And there's a whole nother world of facts out there that I can look into. And so that sort of planted the seed. And then it really wasn't until my life kind of fell apart. He and I got divorced. I had children. And then I was finishing up at this point my bachelor's degree. And I was pregnant with my second child. So this was around 2009. So I've actually I voted for George W. Bush twice. And I voted for John McCain in 2008.
Okay.
And it was 2009 at that point, and I had to take an elective. I had to take a women's studies class. And I was like, oh, Jesus, here we go. Like women's studies. And so there was a class called.
You're like already in the personal development world at this point.
I had done my coach training, but I hadn't officially started my business yet. But I had just started coaching. But at that point, because I wasn't married to my ex anymore, I wasn't like inundated with politics. So I wasn't really, I knew where I stood in terms of like, I totally identified as a Republican. I was part of the, Cal State University San Marcos College Republicans, but I wasn't, well, I guess that's kind of a lie to say like I wasn't a diehard. I would, some of the things I did, Jen, I'm just like, oh my God, did I do that? At school, there was this person who had written in shoe polish on their car something bad about John McCain.
Uh-huh.
And so I took a note and I lectured them in the note, and I talked about how John McCain was a war hero and shame on them and I left it on their windshield, all passive aggressive. But I guess I was kind of a diehard. But I took this class in 2009, and it was called Men and Masculinity. And I'm like, well, that sounds interesting. And mostly because it just fit in with my schedule.
Okay, so that's really funny though, that like when you had to take the women's studies class, you were like, oh my God, do I have to do this?
I didn't want to.
The Men and Masculinity class sounded interesting.
And I don't remember even what I think, to be honest, the reason that I wanted to take it was because I had to, and B, because it worked with my schedule perfectly. Mm-hmm. And it was like one of my last semesters. It was either my last or second to last semester to graduate. And so I think the universe conspired to change my life. This class changed my life. First of all, the first day we had to sit down and introduce ourselves to the person next to us. And I'm like, one of the oldest people in the class as it was. I was in my early 30s then. I sit down next to this girl, and she introduces herself, and she, identifies as a feminist. And I was like, And I said to her, well, then you probably won't like me. And she goes, why? And I said, because I'm a Republican. And she was like, okay. So it was already like jockeying for her position, like, already like, mm-mm. But in that class, big surprise, I'm always a front of the room person. I'm always the one raising my hand, asking questions, participating in discussion. That's always just how I've been. I listened more than anything in that class and was blown away by some of the truths that were being said there. And just these, and they were kids, like, in my opinion, like I wasn't that much older than them, but they were, some of these kids were like 19, 20 years old, and they're just showing me a totally different perspective. And I just, honestly, what it was education. I got schooled in that class. And here's the thing that I think really truly awakened me and pretty much like radicalized me. The thing that I had been mad at my entire life, the catcalling, the never being taken seriously, feeling like I had something to prove all the time, the misogyny, and like all of that, I didn't know there was a name for it. I didn't know that it was misogyny. I didn't know that it was the patriarchy. I didn't know that, like, all of these things. And so I was like, oh my God, this thing that I have rage about is actually about feminism? Like, wait, what? And so it was kind of an unraveling of my identity as well, because I had just been indoctrinated with what it looks like to be a Democrat. Like, there was no, like, it was always bleeding heart liberal. That's all I heard. Yeah. Bleeding heart liberal. And, they just want, it's like socialism. They just want to give all the money away to all of the people who don't have a job. Like, it was that judgment.
Yeah. The people who don't deserve it. Yeah.
The people who don't deserve it. And these people come over to our country and take all our jobs. And that's so un-American. And it's just like patriotism. And to have that all unravel and realize, like, everything that I have been fed was a lie and just so exaggerated it was painful too, to be like, wait a minute. You mean everything I know to be true isn't? And so it was both emotional and just so incredibly eye-opening. And then really that's when the entire script flipped for me.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So it was kind of a sudden, sudden over the course of a semester or what have you.
Yeah, and we had to do a project and I got so into it. Of course, I got an A in the class. We had to write a paper and I did my project actually on, do you remember those Dove commercials? I used to do those workshops and there was a couple of them that they made about media literacy and like just what we as women consume.
Yeah.
That was
like the ones where they would show the model come in and like get all the makeup on and then like how they photoshopped it and like that. Yeah.
It was similar to that one, but they had another one where they showed like a series of images of, I think it's called Onslaught. If you put it in your show notes on YouTube, the video is called Onslaught by Dove. And it's basically like showing all of the images that we see on a daily basis. And then at the very end of the video, it shows two little girls walking by a billboard. I might be getting it mixed up, the videos. But my question for the project was, as women, are we participating in misogyny and patriarchy by really complying to the beauty standards, like weight loss and makeup and plastic surgery and dyeing our hair and all of these things? Like, is there room for both? And it was a really great discussion. And I got to interview all my friends and got so many different opinions. I just loved it. And it just opened my eyes. Critical thinking is what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting to think about it from that perspective when you look at how much critical thinking has been purged from our education system.
Totally.
Because it's very hard to test.
Right?
That's kind of what we rely on. I have my youngest is graduating from high school this month, which is just blows me away.
Right. How did that happen?
It's just kind of this, looking at how education has changed and he's been really blessed to have some amazing teachers. He goes to a really incredible school that, is on one hand serving the most underserved population in Austin, and, has a lot of challenges in that realm. And on the other hand, just has like the most amazing fucking faculty ever that is so dedicated and so excited. And the fact that, I think in some ways, the fact that they're serving this underserved population allows them to fly under the radar a little bit.
Yeah.
And do really cool things, which is great. But, and I'm here in Texas, so our public education is very interesting.
Texas is its own religion.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Well, and that was kind of how, so like listening to your story, and I can really relate to so much in it, and kind of the where you sort of flipped at some point from looking at things one way. And it's so interesting to see what can be the thing that kind of takes you over into looking at things in a really different way. And, I have a similar story, only I flipped and then flopped, basically. So, I grew up in the Rust Belt outside of Detroit, which is a very homogenous culture. These are like the Reagan Democrats. The Union Democrats voted for Reagan in the 80s, and we're actually the same age. So, same kind of timeline. And, although I don't know, like the area that I grew up in tends to be very blue collar. At one point in the mid 2000s, there was a study that looked at the county that I grew up in and determined it to be, it had the lowest number of college educated adults per population in the country, which is really interesting because you wouldn't expect that to be in the Midwest. There are a lot of, stereotypes about us down here in the South, right? So it was a really interesting culture in that, very union oriented, but very socially conservative and really sort of homogenous. By and large, the dads worked for the auto industry and the moms stayed home or maybe cashiered at the grocery store part-time or like something along those lines. The vast majority of adults that I knew, and all of the ones in my family, did not go to college. So that was kind of my perspective. And then when I was 13, my dad's job took us to Austin, Texas.
Oh, okay.
And we moved down here. And, there are a lot of kind of ideas about Austin now. I can tell you that Austin in the late 80s, early 90s, when I went to high school, was very different. It was much smaller. I would argue that it was more liberal than it is now.
Interesting.
Things have changed here a lot in the last 20, 30 years. And I suddenly had a whole different kind of idea of what the world could look like. And I have to say, growing up, I never felt like I fit in, in my hometown, like that kind of thing. When my parents said we were moving to Austin and I was like, sight unseen, yep, I'm in, let's go. Which is probably a little atypical for a 13-year-old. But we came down here and, just getting to know different people. And it was a friend's mom that first got me sort of interested in politics. And like I mentioned before the call, I worked as a volunteer on Ann Richards' first gubernatorial campaign when I was 15. So, which was very interesting. And I kind of like got bit by the bug and got really excited and, was doing some different volunteer work and got really interested in social issues and very much identified as really liberal. And then we moved again right before my senior year to the Boston area. And through a series of events, I joined the military, Army National Guard, right out of high school, and was kind of in this really different culture. For one thing, suddenly I was living somewhere that was much more conservative. And then I was in this military culture that I actually think was quite different in the early 90s than it is now. The U.S. military hadn't really gone much of anywhere in a really long time. And, so there was less discipline in many ways.
Wasn't that the era of don't ask, don't tell? Wasn't that whole time?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So when I was in boot camp was when Clinton was elected.
Okay. Yeah.
For the first time. And, honestly, when I came back, I was in a field artillery brigade. I was one of 3 women, the only one in my section.
Wow.
In with all these men. I was 17 and it was an incredibly toxic culture. So, and it was that was where I really had it like driven home, the fine line that women have to walk. Because it was like, I was going to be steeped in this like gross sort of sexual harassment culture constantly, but expected to laugh it off and not react. At the same time, like you can't join in either because then you become like, sort of a nasty woman or a slut or like whatever, you know what I mean? Like you can't sort of come off that way.
Don't want to get the wrong label.
Yeah. I mean, it was like walking the edge of a razor. And that was kind of like the least of it. There were just a lot of things that went on in that time in my life that left me really sort of reeling from trauma and that kind of thing. And at the end of the whole thing, I walked away from the military with my daughter, who was, I was 19, they handed me this baby that I was just absolutely amazed by and loved more than anything and was terrified that I was going to fuck it up. Like just absolutely terrified. And, so what I did was kind of, I moved back in with my parents. I needed a lot of help from them. I eventually separated from my daughter's father and moved back to the Detroit area with my parents. And like what I remember from that time in my life is just the constant fear and anxiety. Like the constant feeling that at any moment the rug could be jerked out from under me. And the worst thing I could imagine would happen, which would be in my mind, like I felt like someone was going to take my daughter away. Like that was someone was going to look at me and be like, oh my God, you are a fuck up. There is no way you can be allowed to raise this child.
Yes. So many mothers have had that fear. I had that fear when I first had my first baby.
Yeah. I mean, because, they don't come with instructions. It's like, you're just kind of like, you have to figure it out.
I'm just human. I don't know what
like
to do.
An actual human, a real, I had never even had a puppy of my own, like.
Yikes. Yeah.
So, anyway, what that translated to in my mind was lots and lots of people pleasing.
Mm-hmm.
And what that looked like, having moved back to the area where I grew up, was kind of, talking the talk of what I heard around me. And I think I mentioned before our call, I'm not really someone who does things by half measures. So a year into this, what it ended up looking like was me being the president of my chapter of the College Republicans at the community college where I started out. And being, I totally relate to the story about, like, I will say that your story about writing the note and putting it on the person's car sounds very nice and sort of civil,
Oh, well, that was one of the nicer things that I did. I also used to yell at people who did like anti-war protests and told them that they were un-American and that they needed to just move if they didn't like it here.
Yeah. Like,
Leaning out of the car, yelling at them in the intersections.
Yep.
And I got into an argument with someone I worked with once too and called her unpatriotic because she was going to an anti-war protest. And that was bad because she was my friend. I genuinely liked her and that was awful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, so this was kind of like the era that I was in the space was like 96, 97. So, nothing had really happened yet. We were kind of like in the last years of the Clinton administration. There was a lot of, Fox News, I don't think was even a thing yet. What I heard a lot of it
today, yeah,
in my house was the really toxic talk radio.
Oh,
my mom was a huge Rush Limbaugh fan, and like all of that kind of stuff. Like, and no women in my family, I think, had ever identified as a feminist. So, my first encountering of feminism was sort of when I moved to Texas, and even then. I mean, like, you probably remember this from the 90s. Like, it seemed like, oh, yeah, the feminists, like, they were the ones, like, in the 60s that did those things for us. Like, good on them. Now we can just go back to,
they burned their bras and they went back to work. Yeah.
So, it was kind of this, my perception of feminism was that it was something that was over. Like, it was done with. We did that. We won that battle. Like, whatever. Time to move on. And my perception of feminists in the late 90s was like, okay, well, those are just like greedy man-haters. Like, we already got like all of our rights. Like, what are they still bitching about?
Yeah.
So it was kind of this. And then luckily, shortly thereafter, I transferred to University of Michigan, moved, away with my daughter and met my husband and that kind of thing. And it was almost like I had been drinking drugged Kool-Aid, and, a few months in, that started to clear for me. And I really look back and see that, so much of it at the time I was like, what the fuck was I thinking? Like, how did I get there? And looking back now, I can see that so much of it was about like safety and security and just trying to fit into the herd.
Belong.
Yeah. It's all about belonging. And we're both Daring Way facilitators. And I think that, perspective of what do we have to do to belong, even when it's kind of like selling pieces of ourselves along the way, is very real. Like, that's a really deep need that people have to belong.
Yeah. Well, and that's why, when people now talk about, when I hear people say, how could women not be feminists, or how could women have voted the way that they did in the 2016 election, and I'm like, oh, I know why. I know why, because I was that woman. And if you think about, and I'm not saying that it's okay, I see the reasoning behind it and the sort of blindness behind it, is that, and I think about that, like, oh my gosh, if I was still married to him and it was 2016, would I have voted that way? Like, I kind of feel like I just don't think there's a big difference between George Bush and, what we saw in 2016.
Yeah. Well, and it's also, I think that what you described of like being in that culture where all you're hearing is that, right? Like, that's what you're surrounded with. You're not hearing any other perspectives. We are so separated by these, different things. Like, people are in like their own little bubble, and they create their own little bubble around them on social media. And I'm not at all saying that I'm not guilty of this. we have custom newspapers and news channels and, like there's almost no reason to hear anything from the other side if you're not looking for it actively.
No. And at that time, I lived in a predominantly white community. It was actually Poway, California, which has been in the news this week as we're recording this. There was a shooting. And it was predominantly white. And it was, like you said, it's a bubble. And if I did hear about another perspective, it was very one-sided. So for instance, when something had happened, it was probably fires, because there was wildfires all the time in San Diego. And what they would do is they would have, the Red Cross would set something up at like Petco Park, like at the baseball stadium. And so we would hear stories of, oh, did you, and I'm going to be completely frank, like here's the stories we were hearing. I heard that there was this Mexican family that drove up in their minivan and just stocked a bunch of water bottles and drove off and left. So it's like, those are the stories. I'm not kidding you. Like, these are the stories that we heard. And like, oh, did you hear about so-and-so in that neighborhood? And she's collecting welfare, even though she's back with her husband, but they're not going to get married so she can continue collecting. So to me, it's like, that's all I thought existed. Like, I never heard about the people who truly, truly needed it. And which was the vast majority of what was really happening. But it was going back to your point about belonging. And it's like, I think about like, if I would have pushed back, like what if I would have taken that men and masculinity class 10 years earlier and been in my other family, what would have happened? And I think that like on a deep primal biological level, the fear of being rejected would have trumped my values and like that part of me who truly, truly, like that was the real, like how I really felt.
Yeah.
Because it was about my survival. How long I could have stood to be in that pain, I have no idea. And I think that that's the reality for a lot of people out there who are in families that go so against their value system, and the pain of walking away from their family is greater than the pain of staying and just dealing with it.
Yeah. And I also think that when you're in that situation, there's a lot that's going on that has nothing to do with kind of politics and values, but it's kind of like the same thing, like, right? Like, one of the things that I write about a lot is internalized patriarchy, right? When the story that we've been fed our whole lives is to be a good woman, you have to be, thin and pretty and submissive and, compliant,
Right.
not speak up and not be loud or not be rude and take care of people, that goes deep. That gets into your bones. Like those ideas about this is what it means to be good. And when I'm coloring outside of those lines, it means I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do, or it means I'm not, kind of living up to what I should be.
Yeah.
And I think when you're in that much pain over that all the time, that you're not even necessarily thinking in that bigger direction.
No. There's a couple of directions that I would love to go, and you can pick. And so what your story made me think of this friend that I have. And by all accounts and purposes, if you saw her online personality, you'd be like, this woman is a feminist. And she and I have had conversations and where I've been angry about, so for instance, we did a YouTube video together and we would get comments that were super misogynistic and just awful and gross. And I would get upset by them, and she could just kind of like brush it off and laugh it off. And then I would have conversations with her about how catcalling has affected me. And she kind of didn't get it. She wasn't dismissive of my feelings, but she didn't feel the same way. And she was like, I don't mind being viewed as a sexual being. And so I think we're mature enough to have this conversation where we had room for both of our feelings. However, recently she has come around and been like, you know what? I totally see your perspective more. And where I was at was that I just felt like this is part of being a woman. That this is just comes along with the territory, like having a period. Yeah. Or like going through menopause. It's just part of the role that we have to play. And so it's been interesting to watch her sort of revelation and also being angry about it. Like, know that this is not okay, actually, for me and all of the women around me. And then also what I think is interesting, sort of indirectly related, is the conversation that you and I are having about being in families where it goes against everything. As for people of color and like, you know, and many women of color that I've been talking to, the argument and the pushback that we get is that needs, of course, that's valid to have those feelings. And there is room for you to speak up. There is room for you to create change the best way that you can. You can still love those people who gave birth to you and have conversations where you're trying to create change. You don't have to just remain silent. And I wanted to bring that up because I don't want this to be like, well, that's just how it is and it sucks for us. And like, wah, wah. You know what I mean? Like there is still so much work to be done.
Absolutely. And I think that it's really important. I think people get a certain idea in their head about what those conversations need to look like. And the conversation that's actually going to move the needle is not a debate. Like it's a conversation where you actually allow yourself to be vulnerable and invite the other person to do the same. And kind of, you know, and that's something that I have learned in my family the hard way, because there are people in my family that I do feel like I have kind of moved the needle on. And I don't think I've been the only person to do that. Like I'm thinking of my dad a little bit here. But I do feel like I have shifted his perspective and opened his eyes to different things that he may not have seen. If we hadn't had those conversations. And I know that other people in his life have done that too.
Yeah.
And, you know, so I feel like those are the kind of conversations that are more productive than just getting into a debate with someone. But those aren't easy conversations to have. And you have to sort of,
not with the people we love the most.
Right. You've got to have, you know, the emotional intelligence to do it, kind of the, you know, resilience to be able to handle it, and also the ability to create boundaries around it about what's okay and what's not okay.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I've learned the hard way too. I tried to have a conversation. Actually, someone started the conversation with me, someone close to me right after my dad died. So my dad died on October 16th, 2016. And then the election was November 7th. Was it November 6th, 2016? So it was like 3 weeks later.
Yeah.
And it was about, I don't know, a couple of months after that someone I love, a member of my family, tried to start a conversation via text message. And I was not having it. It was ugly because I took it personally. And I'm like, you are stepping on my personal values and who I am as a human being. And so I think in retrospect, what would have been helpful was, I think, being someone who's been on both sides is that, and I kind of put myself in the perspective, okay, it's like, what if I was over there? How would I appreciate having a conversation? And what would I be open to hearing? I think first and foremost, you need to make sure that you're not making someone else wrong. You know, if someone would come to me and said, like, I feel that that's really unpatriotic and I feel like you're being a racist for voting Republican, you know, I would have been like, I'm not going to talk to you. Who are you to tell me?
That kind of shuts the whole thing down.
It shuts the whole thing down. And so I think that we need to first and foremost listen to other people and have them understand that we are listening. Because at the end of the day, we all want the same thing. Like we all want love and safety and opportunities and resources for us and our family.
Yeah.
Everybody wants that. We all just have different avenues of getting there. That's really what the divide is. And we all think we're the good guy. Everybody does.
Yes. Yeah.
And so it becomes this conversation of like jockeying for who's more of a victim based on political issues and who has it, you know, who has it worse, who's more of a victim and who's right or wrong. And I think it's just like, we have to listen to the other side as much as it pains us and say, I hear you. And what about this? Because I think that having been where I was, the biggest thing I didn't understand is someone else's experience.
Yes. Yeah.
Didn't understand it. And even I think if I did, I'd be like, oh, that sucks for them. And that's actually not my problem. So it was what I needed to know is like understanding that actually it is my problem because we're all humans.
Because we're all
in have a lot of compassion back then.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, it's funny, like I think in that few weeks after the election, like, I don't know that any of us were in a place to have that conversation, especially having just lost your dad. Right.
Yeah. It was bad timing.
And it, you know, and I know for me, that conversation happened really publicly on social media when my kids and I went to the protests at the state capitol the day after the election, and I live streamed it on Facebook. Which felt like the right thing to do at the time, and certainly changed many relationships in my family, some of which have not fully recovered.
Yeah.
You know, and it really, I think, but what you said about needing to listen is so important, because I think that conversation starts with listening to someone, even when you really believe that they are absolutely fucking wrong.
Right.
And hearing
Wouldn't you want the same for you?
Exactly. Because it's not like, when you really start to listen and really start to ask them about their own feelings, like getting out of the rhetoric, getting out of like the, toxic bullshit that is spewed, frankly, on both sides sometimes, like, and getting into, but how does that affect you? And how do you really feel about that? And, because often what's underneath there is a whole lot of fear.
Oh, totally. That's all that's underneath.
Yeah. And I mean, that's what you kind of have to like tap into and, hold space for, to be able to sort of move that needle.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tricky thing to do, for sure.
It's tricky. And again, I just want to reiterate for people listening that I think it's the trickiest when it's the people you care about the most.
Yeah.
I talk about that all the time in my program.
Absolutely necessary. Like it's what we have to do.
And I think that this is the work that you do with the people that you love the most is probably your biggest life's work. And It's not just about these conversations, it's about boundaries. It's about hard conversations. It's about being vulnerable and telling people how you feel about them, expressing gratitude. Like that's, it's like I'm really transparent with my clients, and I'm like, listen, it's one thing for me to have a hard conversation or set a boundary with my neighbor or my kids' teachers or even my husband. But it's like, you asked me to have that conversation with my mom or my sister. Uh-huh. And I'm procrastinating, and I'm like, oh yeah, I'll get to that tomorrow. It's the hardest people, especially our family of origin. And that's where I think a lot of this
for sure happen. Because unlike your family of origin and the family that you create, you kind of have the option when you're, in a relationship with another adult and when you have kids and whatever, to sort of create that language about boundaries and make that okay and have that be sort of an ongoing part of the conversation. Whereas when you go out to set a boundary with someone that doesn't even know what the hell that is, and just is going to have a lot of opinions about what you're doing, that's a really different thing. And it takes more of our energy and resilience.
It
to
does.
hold those
It
lines,
takes
for sure.
And like you were saying, it takes emotional intelligence but I do think that it's worth it. I don't want people to listen to this conversation and walk away being like, that sounds like too much work. These are the things that are going to really allow you to grow and stand in your values, which I think is at the end of the day, that's all any of us want. That's what makes us feel the best, is to show up and stand in the person that we're proud of.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like anything, right? Like we think about any type of sort of, doing the work from a social emotional perspective, right? The reason that we do this work is because ultimately it's going to kind of make us feel better and get us to the next place and that kind of thing. But it's not that it's not work, for sure.
I wish there was an easier way, because if there was, I'd be selling it.
Yeah, same here. So, and I want to just briefly touch on like what you were talking about, like with the catcalling and kind of the different perceptions of that, because that is something that, I like before the last few years had gone all over the map with too. And I think it's that there's so many things tied up in wanting to not be sexualized and also still wanting to be desirable.
Right.
And there's like so much in that.
That's the conflict.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And a bit of a dichotomy, because there's one thing like, and I think, I forget, is it Esther Perel that talks about, she's that relationship psychologist who's written a couple of books. And she talks about how for women, like one of our biggest turn-ons and ways that we feel loved by our partner is knowing that we're desired by them. So
Yes.
it makes sense that like if there are multiple people out into the world, even if they're strangers and they are expressing their desire, that we would see that as feeling love. So I think that we're conditioned to think that that is a compliment.
Yes.
And for me, just, it would make me so mad growing up. And I have like open hand slapped people across the face for saying just like such lewd things to me. And I think that at the end of the day, what I realized made me so angry is that it's dehumanizing. You are reducing me to, you are not seeing me for as a human. And I think for me personally, my journey has been feeling like I always was never taken seriously. Just sort of like patted on the head, and always trying to prove my worth. And feeling like if my body and my appearance is the only way that I'm going to prove my worth, like how, because I know that this is slipping through my fingers. Like I'm 44 now and I'm like saying goodbye to it. So it was infuriating and frustrating because I felt like it was something I should be thankful for. Like you should be thankful. And it's a huge conflict.
And on a lesser level, like I think you could almost say the same thing about, the situations where some random guy is walking by you in the grocery store and they're like, oh, smile, it's not that bad. Like, that same kind of thing. Like I used to take as, oh, that's just someone like trying to be nice or whatever. And, now I'm kind of like, you know what, fucking bullshit. Like I don't exist to make your existence comfortable.
No. And I mean, I have story after story. There was a guy in high school and I was like kind of friends with him. I was friends with his sister and he would call me, his nickname for me was Tits in high school. And he would yell it across the hallway and be like, what's up, Tits? And I was like, ha. And it, like, it makes my skin crawl and just, it's a lot to contend with.
Yeah, for sure. So I think we need to wrap up here, but I just want to say thanks so much for coming on and having this great conversation. I feel like this is one that that we'll probably both keep talking about, and maybe you can come back in the future and we'll talk about it again, because I feel like
we could talk for another hour on this, so I can for sure come back.
Yeah, I absolutely think so. Yeah, and I think it is the conversation that we need to be having more of with lots of women, because at the end of the day, we're all in this together, and I'm such a believer in sisterhood and kind of finding ways to raise each other up.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been super fun.